Hello, this is Dudley Riggle. For nearly 60 years, I've had the great privilege of being part of the Carthage community, and my life has been greatly enriched by knowing, learning with, and learning from literally thousands of people. I'm blessed with good memories of so many good days and good times together. Now, as we all know all too well, we are in the midst of difficult days and trying times. And that's true for us as individuals, as families, as communities, and as a country and a world. Indeed, it seems as if every day we are reminded of terrible and tragic losses. The loss of lives due to a virus and other conditions, loss due to violence, and loss due to violent weather and fires, and the loss of homes and workplaces and work itself, and the loss of life together as we knew it and want it to be. And the list of those losses goes on and on. Because of those losses, we are frequently grieving. But because we tend to associate grieving mainly with death, we are often not aware that we are grieving and that we need to grieve and to understand the nature of grief. The program you are about to see and hear is about grief and grieving. It's entitled Grieving Our Losses and Living with Hope. It was recorded several years ago at a Carthage College alumni event. Some of you may have heard it in the Carthage course Issues and Living and Dying, and still others may have heard it when it was given annually for many years for people in the Kenosha and Racine area. It's being offered now with the hope that it will help you, and perhaps help you to help others, to go on living and loving and hoping and believing in these times of great loss.
This time together is about loss, about living with loss and about living with hope. You and I have something in common with each other and with all people in the world, and that is the experience of loss and the experience of living with that loss. Doesn't it seem to you that every day as we hear or watch the news, we are reminded of loss, terrible, tragic losses, and how devastating those losses are in the lives of people? Perhaps it's a personal loss that has brought you here today. I don't know all of you. I know a great many of you. And I know enough about some of you to know something of the losses you have dealt with and in some cases are still dealing with. And I'm sorry for that loss, and especially for the pain and the sadness and the sorrow that loss always brings. Perhaps, on the other hand, you're here because you're wondering, how does one go on living and hoping and believing in a world where we are so often surrounded with loss? It is my hope that what is said today will help us to better understand the many thoughts and feelings and reactions we have when we experience loss. It's also my hope today that what is said will help us to help ourselves and help others as we are grieving. And with those hopes in mind, I want to talk about several things. I want to talk about the place of winners and losers in our culture. I want us to think about our own experience with separation and loss and name some losses. I want to talk about the reaction to separation and loss, which is grief. I want to give a definition of grief that's a little too academic, but I want to talk about the nature of grief, what it's like to grieve, and what it's like to be a griever. I want to say something about the stages of grieving, and some studies about the length of grief, the good old American question, how long will my grief last? I hope you hear a little irony in that. Folks, it's bad enough to grieve. Don't worry if you're doing it in the right way or the right amount of time. In fact, if you take nothing else away, take this away. When you have a loss, let yourself grieve in your own time and in your own way. I want to identify some do's and don'ts to keep in mind when we try to help ourselves and others. Usually in speaking, I say very little about myself. I think some of you know I'm a rather private person. But I think with this topic, it's important that I give some background. For more than 50 years, I've had an academic interest in the topic of loss and grief. For most of my career at Carthage, almost 30 years of my career here, I taught the course once called Death and Dying and more recently called Issues in Living and Dying. So I have an academic interest. But if my interest were only academic, I wouldn't be standing here today. I also have a professional involvement. Not long ago, I was introduced as one of the founding fathers of hospice in Wisconsin. I'm not sure how I feel about that founding father stuff. I get enough reminders of my age. But I've been involved in the hospice movement in Wisconsin since its beginning days. Helped start one here in Kenosha, served on the board, trained volunteers, served as a volunteer chaplain. And to this day, there's not a week that goes by that I'm not talking with, sitting with a grieving or dying person. So I have a professional interest. But if my interest were only academic or only professional, I wouldn't be here either. The most important thing I can say and want you to know is that I'm obviously a fellow human being, very human, but I'm a fellow griever. My age is 78. So have experienced many losses, especially the death of friends, colleagues, relatives. In my prayers this morning, I counted 24 deaths within the last 12 months. A lot of loss, a lot of loss. So I stand before you as a fellow griever. Now, perhaps at this point, someone's thinking, oh, this is going to be depressing. It just begins to clear up outside, no more gloomy weather, and now we're going to have a gloomy topic. My answer to that is, I don't think it will be depressing, but I think it may be difficult. And there's a very significant difference between that which is depressing and that which is difficult. Indeed, it's when we face the difficult that we get what we say we want, a sense of relief and significance and satisfaction. It's when we refuse to face the difficult that we get depressed and we experience other emotional problems too. You may remember that the Swiss psychologist Carl Jung once said, what we call neurosis is often the result of our despairing refusal to deal with the legitimate difficulties of life. What we call neurosis is often the result of our refusal to deal with the legitimate, that is, the normal difficulties of life. Let me give you a little illustration of that. Do you know what it is to have something to do that you don't want to do? A letter to write, a conversation to have, right? An assignment to begin. What do most of us do? We put it off, put it off, put it off. Question, do you get any relief from putting it off? No. What do you get? More worry, more anxiety. When do you get any sense of relief and satisfaction? When you get the first words on the page. When you pick up the phone and say, we've got to talk. It is in facing the difficult, which you're doing, that we get what we say we want, that sense of relief and satisfaction. Whenever we think about or talk about, as we will today, the bad and the sad in life, I think it's important to keep in mind that we have two amazing abilities. I think they're God-given abilities. The ability to keep things in perspective and the ability to hold on to our hope, our humor, our humanity in the midst of the bad and the sad. Keep it in perspective. I always said if I could decorate my own classroom, I would have above the whiteboard the words, keep it in perspective. I always put it on the board every day. What did I mean by that? Well, of course, keep every word of every presenter in perspective. There's always a chance we're dead wrong, you know. Okay. Keep it in perspective. But more than that, I mean, in the midst of the bad and the sad, remember, no matter how hard, how bad, how sad times are, there are always good times, good events, good occasions, good people. It's important to remember that. Incidentally, if you are grieving, and if you come to the point where you're having a good half day, a good day, a good week, let yourself have that. For a lot of grievers, when they begin to feel a little normal, have a good day, they immediately feel guilty about it. They say, what right do I have to feel good given what has happened? Give yourself permission to have that. Keep it in perspective. We have that ability. We also have an ability that relates to our resiliency, our ability to bounce back. And that's that ability to hold on to hope and humor and humanity in the midst of the hard and horrid. There are always some stories I tell to illustrate that ability. One of them comes out of the Holocaust. Now, there's hardly anything humorous about the Holocaust, but I would remind us that during the Holocaust, you know, people wrote plays and prisoners performed them. Scholarly manuscripts were written. People sacrificed for one another. They held on to their humanity. The story is told about one camp, and in that camp, there were few survivors, and among the survivors was an aging Jewish man. Now, not many older people made it through. You know the sign over the camp, work or die. And so not many older people made it through. But this old Jew had. And one night, during the daily exercise period, he was standing outside, peering through the electrified barbed wire fence. Incidentally, very few people took the option of throwing themselves against that fence. That was always there. But he was peering pensively at the night sky, and he heard a crunching sound behind him. And he turned and he saw a Nazi guard. And he thought he would try a little put on, little put down, little humor. He clicked his heels, put his hand up, and said, Heil Hitler. And the Nazi guard, not seeing that as satire, but taking it as a sign of serious respect for the fatherland, turned to the old Jew and said, for that sign of respect and regard, I will give you a choice. You may choose the manner of your death in this camp. And the old Jew thought for a while, and he said, thank you. Make it natural, please. There it is, holding on to that hope and humor and humanity. Whenever I think about that, I think of a remarkable person I met here on the campus many years ago. Her name was Pat. I'll tell you a couple of Pat stories. Pat walked into our office, just presented herself. She wasn't related to Carthage, but she simply said, I need to talk to somebody. I had a little time. She ended up in my office. She came in, I remember, bright, bouncy, attractive, athletic. I soon learned aggressive and assertive. Nothing wrong with that. But she plopped down and she said, I'm dying. I found that very difficult to believe. She looked so healthy. But I learned it was true. She had just come from a university hospital with a diagnosis of lung cancer, which had metastasized and was in her brain. And she said, I'm dying, and I want you to promise me 3 things. I've just met her. She said, I want you to promise me I won't die alone, that I won't die in the hospital, and there will be somebody to take care of my 11-year-old daughter. She was a single mother, sister in Boston, mother in Florida. She had been in a dating relationship. When she got the diagnosis, he deserted right away. That's not uncommon. I said to Pat, I have just met you. I know we don't want to die alone, and we'll make every effort to make sure you don't die alone. About not dying in the hospital, I'm not sure. She said, wait a minute, I know a little about you. You're trying to get a hospice started. I said, yes, but we're just trying. She said, well, that enables people to die at home. I said, yes, it does, but I don't know if we'll be up and running in time. And she said, well, you better work on it, because she was that kind of person. And I said about somebody to care for your 11-year-old daughter. I said, that's a great concern. We'll give some thought to that. Well, Pat ended up where she didn't want to be. 6 months at St. Catherine's Hospital, old St. Catherine's. Now, we all know today you can't stay that long in a hospital, but in those days you could. And I called on Pat about every day for 6 months as a volunteer chaplain. I think most of you know the line to death is not like this, right? The line to death is like this. Good days, bad days, alert days, not alert days. And one day I walked in to call on Pat, and the line was obviously low. She did not open her eyes. She did not respond. I went to the bedside. I did what I always do, assume every word you say is understood. Told her I'd seen her 11-year-old daughter who had showed me her homework. Pat was a Bears fan. I shared the score of the Sunday before. And then no response, no open eyes, nothing. And then I said, Pat, I'm going to have prayer before I go. I kept my eyes open. I usually do when I pray. And when I finished the prayer, still no response. But I looked at the open door, and there were 2 nurses' aides, and they had been trying to get my attention. And one of them said to me, well, you better give up. She hasn't responded to anything for 48 hours. Whereupon my friend Pat opened one eye and said, remember they say the hearing's the last thing to go. She was playing possum. You know, she was impish, right? The line came up a little for Pat. And one day, calling on her, I asked what some of you will recognize as the hospice question. Pat, does anything sound good to you today? You know what that question's about. You try to get the juices going, the appetite juices, the juices for life. So I said, Pat, does anything sound good to you today? And she said, yeah, that guy who models jockey shorts. Now, this is not the answer I'm expecting. I said, huh? She said, the guy who models jockey shorts. She said, you get him to come visit me. And I said, how could I do that? She said, easy. You're at Carthage College. Donna Stegerwelt, the CEO of Jockey, is on your board of trustees. You talk to Donna. You get Jim Palmer to come see me when he's in town. Well, on the way out, I told the story to the charge nurse. And the next day when I went in, at the foot of Pat's bed was a life-size poster of Jim Palmer in the briefest of jockey briefs. Maybe the hearing is not the last thing to go. Well, why tell stories like that? Because they illustrate that ability to hold on to hope, humor, humanity in the face of the bad and sad, and to keep it in perspective. With that in mind, think with me for a while about winners and losers in our culture. I'm not telling you anything you don't know when I tell you that we live in a time and a place which puts a tremendous emphasis on winning, right? Everybody wants to be a winner. Nobody wants to lose anything to anyone, anywhere, anytime, for any reason whatsoever. Think of this. Have you ever seen any little kids walking up and down a soccer field or a basketball court with finger in air saying, we're number one, we lost today? Think of that. Do you ever see that? Well, we don't live very long till we lose some, right? And they're not just games, so games are important in our culture. We lose people. We lose relationships. We lose jobs. We lose dreams. And so here's the question. How can we have that experience, which is so common, so much a part of life, without ending up feeling like one of the losers of this life? A young widow put it to me. She said, I thought I was prepared for my husband's death, but what I was never prepared for was that I would end up feeling like one of the losers of this life. Odd person out in a couple-oriented society, fifth wheel, castes set apart. She said, almost as bad as this experience of losing my husband is that I have somehow ended up feeling on the losing team. Well, there's the question. How can we have that common experience without ending up feeling like a loser? Or to put it another way, is there some insight, some information some faith, some hope that can help us go on living and hoping. There's a story about that. It's a story about a fire. Anybody here ever have a house burned down or burned out by a fire? Yes, okay. That's a tragic loss. I was never able to raise a hand. I can in a way. Last November, our grandson and his family were burned out of their home, lost everything but their lives. So when a fire burns down or burns out a house, that's a devastating event. It's doubly devastating when there's loss of life, right? But even when there's no loss of life, it's a devastating event because people are devastated how? Emotionally, right? Separated from a familiar place, favorite possessions. Oh, you know, you can go out and buy a new television. You can get a new sofa. But what can't you replace? The diaries. Yeah, the antique rocker from Aunt so-and-so. Precious things. So when a fire burns down or burns out a house, people grieve, as at death, and they ask the very same question. How do you pick up the pieces and begin again? A man to whom I am much indebted, a mentor of mine, Dr. Rule Howe, tells a story about a fire. He said, after a devastating fire wiped us out except for the clothes on our backs, my father and I were returning with supplies from a distant village to which we had gone. And he said, when we came back to what had been our home and now was just smoking and smoldering ruins, we found that Mother, who had stayed behind, had prepared for lunch. She had dragged a big log out of the woods for a temporary kitchen table, and he said in the middle of that log she had placed a rusty tin can filled with spring wildflowers. And he said, somehow that said it. It spoke of my mother's faith and hope. It said, in the midst of loss, there is a power of recovery. In the midst of falling, there's reason to get up again. And whenever Dr. Howe tells that story, he asks what I think is a pointed and poignant question. He says, do you have any wildflowers in a rusty tin can not far from your smoking ruins? Now, notice the question is not, do you have any smoking ruins? Now, that's the world we want, right? No burned out jobs, no burned up relationships, no burned down houses, no burned out lives. But that's not the available world. I mean, we can relate to Dr. Seuss in his poem, Young Gerald McGrew. Remember, if I ran the zoo, said young Gerald McGrew, I'd make a few changes, that's what I'd do. Yeah, make me king, queen, God for a day, and I'll make a world with no smoking ruins. It's not the available world. So the question is not, do you have any smoking ruins? The question is, do you have any wildflowers in a rusty tin can not far from those smoking ruins? And in that question are two other questions. Do you have some insight, some understanding, some faith, some hope to carry you through? And just as important, do you have a symbol for that in your life? For one person, the symbol was spring wildflowers in a rusty tin can. We'll return to that image at the very end of our time together. That's something about winners and losers. Now think with me about separation and loss. It strikes me, and perhaps you too, that life begins and ends as a profound separation experience, right? At birth, we are separated from what? The warm, the familiar, the protected, the protecting, we call it womb. And at death, what are we separated from? Same thing. Warm, familiar, protected, protecting. We call it family, partnership, relationship, and we enter some form of a tomb. Now, think, if you can, about the many separations in between womb and tomb, right? When I first began doing this many years ago, I would say to people, remember your first separation experience, being dropped off at kindergarten. Do you know how that would date and outdate a speaker today? Do you know the first separation experience for most children? 4 to 6 weeks, dropped off at daycare, right? Profound separation experience. Maybe you know of another separation experience. Ever been with a child at a shopping mall and suddenly the little one's gone? And the sheer panic of that for parent and child, profound separation experience. For years, my wife taught in an experimental early childhood education program. They began with something called Little Nursery, graduated the next year to Big Nursery, graduated from Big Nursery to Little Kindergarten, from Little Kindergarten to Big Kindergarten, the next year to regular kindergarten, and they graduated from kindergarten wearing caps and gowns. Is there anything more ridiculous than a 5-year-old in a cap and gown? Yeah, academics in caps and gowns. But all those separation experiences. Do you remember separating from elementary school to junior high or middle school? Remember graduating from high school where you knew it all, were known, and you knew, and now you're going to the unknown, profound separation. Oh, what was it after high school for you? More school, college, military, work, maybe later marriage, maybe you had children of your own, maybe one of those got lost in a shopping center one day. Do you see the cycle? Now, obviously, not all separations are bad. That's very important. Some separations are natural, normal, necessary, even good. Birth, for example, is a necessary separation experience. And we smile at that. But you know what happens if the little one stays in there too long? Same thing that happens if it comes out too soon. Dies. That's a parable, folks. We can be protected in life to the point of suffocation and death, right? The world we're involved in right now, the world of words. You know that world is absolutely dependent upon separation for meaning and significance. Do you ever think of that? Without some separation in the spoken word called pause, what do you have? Run-on noise, more nonsensical than speaking often is. And without some separation in the printed word, what do you have? Run-on letters, meaningless. That's a parable too. It means some separation is necessary for meaning and significance. True in the world of human relationships. What do we say in the midst of the best relationships? Need some privacy. Need some time alone. Need some distance. Need some space. We say in marriage, and the two become one. And the big debate is, which one shall the two become? But we know in the best of relationships, there needs to be some separation, some space. If, as I would assume most of us, if we're typical in this room, believe that there's something after this life, we don't know for sure until the separation experience called death. Some separations are natural, normal, necessary, even good, but come on. If we're honest, what's our experience with separation? Nasty, painful, distasteful. It hurts. And so a writer whose writings I like a great deal, Sloan Wilson, has this line. He says, "For me, strong feelings of love always come mixed with an acute fear of loss." He says, "Therefore I go through life in an advanced state of panic." Now that's hyperbole. Strong feelings of love always come mixed. Let yourself love someone or something. What do you have right away? Fear of losing it. So I go through life in an advanced state of panic. To say it another way, open yourself to life and love. You open yourself to pain and loss. There is no other way. There's a way once it happens. It's called the way of self-protection and isolation and insulation. Some people, having really been burned, well, you know what it sounds like. Never going to get that close again. Never going to be that trusting again. Never going to be that vulnerable again. So some people, it strikes me, make a deal with life. I don't say it critically. I understand it. They say, in order never again to have that sharp pain of separation, I'll take the long, dull pain of isolation and separation. Open yourself to life and love. You open yourself to pain and loss. Let me say that two other ways. One a little earthy, the other a little more academic, the earthy one. It will probably disappoint or maybe even surprise some of you when I say my hobby is auto racing. I can give a theological defense of it. I watch races seriously. I often say I read automobile books religiously and the Bible automatically. But now, you don't have to be a race fan to know the name of A.J. Foyt. He's been around forever as a driver. Now he's a car owner. He has a reputation of being really hard, cold, gruff, callous. Now, what have you learned about people like that? They're the marshmallows of life. You know that, right? They need that thick shell. He does not like interviewers, reporters. He tolerates them. Once I had a ticket to a race at State Fair Park in Milwaukee, and I had a pit pass. Now, if you're a race fan, a pit pass is like a ticket to heaven. You just get right down there with the cars and drivers. So right after the race, I went to the pit of A.J. Foyt. You stand back. He barks but does not bite. There was a reporter there from a Milwaukee paper, and the reporter said, A.J., one question today. And he said, one question is all any of you guys get today. And I'll never forget the reporter said, A.J., do you have any friends in this business? And I'll never forget his answer. He said, no, by choice. You get close to people in this business, and they get hurt, and you end up being hurt. Oh, they get hurt, and you end up being hurt. Is that a cold, callous person? I don't think so. Now, something a little more academic. Won't be any smarter than what A.J. Foyt said, but more academically respectable. From the book, The Road Less Traveled by M. Scott Peck. I have copies of this for you if you want. If you move out to another human being, there's always the risk that that person will move away from you, leaving you more painfully alone than you were before. Love anything that lives, a person, a pet, a plant, and it will die one day. Trust anyone, and you may be hurt. Depend on anyone, and that one may let you down. The price of love turns out to be pain. That's not all, but if someone is determined not to risk pain or loss, then such a person is going to have to do without many things that make life life, like relating to people, like dating, like getting into a partnership, like having children, like the ecstasy of sex, the hope of ambition, the world of friendship. All that makes life alive and meaningful and worthwhile move out or grow in any dimension, and pain as well as joy will be your reward. But the only alternative is not to live fully or not to live at all. William Faulkner once said, if I had to choose between pain and nothing, I'll take pain every time. Why? When you're hurt, you know you're still alive. Recognize the name Leo Buscaglia. The late Leo Buscaglia spoke so movingly on romantic love. He once said, I never met a great lover who was not terribly scarred. Right? Wow. Maybe that's what those worry lines are all about, or I think of the scarred hands and feet of Jesus of Nazareth. Okay. Open yourself to life and love. You open yourself to pain and loss. Well, that's something about separation. Now, something about loss. Loss and separation are obviously similar, but losses are more what? Particular, precise, pointed. I think most of us tend to believe that the hardest loss is the death of a person. Please, I would never, ever minimize that. I know about that. It's a terrible loss in most cases. But I want to suggest to you that it may not be the hardest loss we deal with in life. In fact, if I've learned anything in, 50 years now of sitting with grieving people, it is this. Don't rank losses. Don't play the game, oh, this is the worst loss that could be. Just when I think I know the worst loss possible, I hear another story. And often the stories are not about actual deaths. You know the phrase horrid little deaths? Yeah, and we're not talking about actual death, but we know they're not so little and they're pretty horrid. Okay. Several years ago at Carthage, I had in my class a non-traditional student. That's a euphemism for someone more than 22 years old. I knew she was more than 22 because she and I had dated one another when we were back in Ohio, and I knew she was a lot more than 22 because I was, right? We went our separate ways, as they said in our little town. She married well, meaning she married a physician and not a would-be pastor professor. We both ended up in this part of the country. And I learned one day that her physician husband, just like that, deserted her. Time passed. She took the course, Issues in Living and Dying. She got married. I heard it was a good second marriage. We exchanged letters. And one day I got a phone call. And she said, I went away for the weekend alone. And when I came back Sunday afternoon, I pulled the car up, got out, walked up the sidewalk. It was the fall of the year. The screen was still in. She said, door was open. She said, I looked in, saw my husband slumped in the chair, and I said, oh, yes, asleep in front of the TV. Said he wasn't asleep, he was dead. An aneurysm. Well, we talked. We talked 4 weeks later, 6 weeks later. 6 months later, I get a phone call. She said, Dudley, I'm going crazy. I said, I doubt it, but what? She said, help me to understand this. How is it that as bad as the death of my second husband is, it's not nearly as hard as the desertion by my first husband? She said, at least this death doesn't call into question my self-worth and self-esteem. Don't rank losses. For years, twice a year, I had a humbling speaking experience to speak to a group called Parents Caring and Sharing, which is our local chapter of Society of Compassionate Friends. Now, to get into that group, you have to have a child die or killed. Now, the child could be a 2-year-old or a 30-year-old. That's somebody's child. They begin every meeting the same way, going around the room and each person telling his or her story about the death of his child. Then the speaker is asked to speak. You talk about a humbling speaking experience. I once began by saying to them, you people have experienced the greatest loss that I as a parent and grandparent can imagine, and that is the death of a child. And a woman just shot her hand up. She said, you're wrong. I said, well, I'll listen to you. I've heard your story. She said, yes, we're the ones who had that 2-year-old run over by a semi-truck. I said, I know. She said, but let me tell you something. We've had a 15-year-old missing for 3 years, and that's a lot harder to deal with. Don't rank losses. Well, we've talked about death, divorce, desertion. We could mention psychological divorce as a loss. People still legally married, but in fact, not really married anymore. Would you, and I'm not sure how this is going to work with the video, but just call out some other losses and do it quickly, and I'll repeat them because I'm on mic here. What are some other losses that you are aware? You don't have to say it's your own, but what are you aware of? What kinds of losses are people dealing with these days? Job loss, yes. Forced retirement. Loss of health, yes. I need a hand with the voice. I think most of you know I'm deaf, right? In one ear and aided in the other. I'm a lip reader, and so I need a hand with the voice. And if you want to say something to your neighbor and you don't want me to know what it is, put your hand up over your mouth. Okay. All right. So we've got loss of health, loss of jobs. Yes, economic situation. Yeah, tremendous loss for people. Foreclosure of houses, yes. Pardon? Moving into unfamiliar, new stage of life. Children are gone, or spouse is gone, or moving to a new part of the country. Yes. Let me rattle off some others. Loss of prestige, falling on your face in front of a group. Loss of position, not getting the job everybody thought you would, right? Loss of possessions. We say things don't count. How do you explain tearing the house apart for 2 hours to find a 50-cent item that you could have gone out in 10 minutes and replaced? Right? It's not my special pen. You know, that kind of, things do count, as we said. Loss of body parts. We've learned with childbirth, postpartum depression, with mastectomy and hysterectomy. Do you know, we now know with the loss even of the end of a finger, there is a mini grief that follows. We have this tremendous sense of wholeness. Loss of hearing. My dad became legally blind 3 years before his death. Loss of sexual interest, sexual opportunity. Loss of innocence. When did it happen to you? It's not what you think. No, it's not confession time. No, when did you learn that you're not as pure and noble and upright and trustworthy as you always thought you were? And when did you learn that other people aren't as pure and noble and trustworthy and upright as you counted on their being? That loss of innocence is one of the great losses of life. It's what makes cynics and skeptics of all of us. I'm sure all those, yes, did I see another hand? Yes. Loss of your profession, right. We're so identified with our work. Good. Yes, something that's life-changing, then the person is no longer the person that you knew anymore. Loss of trust? Yes. Okay. All those losses and more are represented, I'll bet, in this room. When we experience loss, when we experience separation, then it is that we grieve. And now I want to talk about the nature of grief and give a definition. Again, that sounds too clinical, too academic. But a definition that I've worked on and worked up for years goes something like this. Grief is the emotional response to loss with physical manifestations and relational implications. Let me try to unpack that. Grief is the emotional response to loss. You lose something, a person, a possession, a job, a pet. Oh, we should have mentioned loss of pet. Yeah. And right away, you feel what I call primary emotions, two of them, short, simple, three-letter words. You feel mad and sad. Problem, we're not comfortable with those strong primary emotions, and people around us aren't comfortable with them either. And so what do? We push them down. And they come out in what I would call secondary emotions. I'll bet you know about them. That sense of lethargy. Just lack of interest in anything. Somebody talked about walking on leaden feet from room to room. Sense of withdrawal, sense of separation, ouchiness, moodiness, difficulty keeping your mind on anything. Those are the secondary emotions. Grief is the emotional response to loss, also with physical manifestations. Shows up in the body, right? Let's think of the loss, the death of a person. And you've gotten the news. Some of you have been through this. Do you remember things that happen in your body? I'm talking physicality here, not emotion. What are some of those things that you feel in your body? What's going on in the body when you get the news of a loss? Do you remember? Yes.
Stomachache.
Stomach, yeah, the stomach just churns, yes. Yeah. What else? Upset stomach.
Your heart starts pounding.
Your heart starts pounding, right.
Your mind starts racing.
Yeah, your mind races, and that's chemical, physical too. Your mind races. Numb, oh yeah, just a feeling that you can't feel anything, that you're physically numb. Yes.
Can't sleep.
Can't sleep, yeah, sleeplessness.
Dizziness.
Disorientation, yeah. Pain in the back. For some people, these great muscles let go. For some people say, I think I'm going to vomit. They do vomit. Notice something. A year after the loss, you can be reminded of the loss and get a mini manifestation of those things. Check yourself sometime when you're having some symptoms. Ask if you've been reminded of a loss. Other things will do it too. Grief is the emotional response to loss with physical manifestations and relational implications. That is, loss changes our relationships with people. People don't know what to do with grievers, right? So they tend to abandon them, ignore them, and it really does something to one's ability to feel close or to try to get close again to anyone. And there's another relationship it affects, the relationship we call faith, the relationship with God. And that often really confuses people. They say, what's going on? My faith is important to me. I thought my faith would carry me through. Well, it is carrying me through, but somehow I feel distance. Oh, yeah. When do you feel more alone than when you're sitting in church alone, worshiping for the first time? That's a tremendous reminder of aloneness. Or maybe the death raises questions like of the fairness of God, the justice of God, and why bad things happen. Grief is the emotional response to loss with physical manifestations and relational implications. Another way to think about it is to talk about the nature of grief, what it's like. I'm going to use 3 short, simple sentences, and they're going to be tremendously obvious, and that's the problem. A great intellectual, George Orwell, once said, "It is the first duty of intelligent people, don't be modest, to know the obvious." It is the first duty of intelligent people to know the obvious. What happens when we forget the obvious? Oh, we trip over it. We get tripped up by it. What I'm going to say is terribly obvious, but that's the problem. Nature of grief. 1, loss is real. What's more obvious than that? The pet's gone, the person's gone, the position's gone. But if you've been through it, you know how we talk. This doesn't seem real. Or it seems unreal and yet all too real. I keep thinking I will see him or her. I keep thinking this is a nightmare, and I'll wake up and find it's not real. There's another thing. You know, in a way, we all write our life story in advance. We do. And when we do that, we never have a chapter called My Divorce or the death of my child. And so when it happens, it doesn't seem real. Now, one of the problems of living in not only a death-denying, but a loss-denying culture is that people around us don't acknowledge our loss. And so that makes it feel all the less real, too. Loss is real. 2, therefore, sadness, sorrow, anger, even rage are natural and normal. Again, what's more obvious than that? You lose something dear to you. What's more obvious than being mad, sad? What have you learned about yourself when you get hurt? Do you get mad or do you get sad? I think you can divide the world that way. Some little kids are on a field playing, one gets hurt and starts to cry. The other kid gets hurt and is up ready to fight, right? What have you learned about yourself? Sometimes it's a combination of the two. Loss is real. Sadness, sorrow, anger, rage, normal and natural. 3, therefore, we need to express those feelings openly and unashamedly. Notice I did not say publicly. We would be far better off to be in other cultures where they express their grief publicly, openly, and unashamedly. We don't. What's the problem? We live in a culture that puts a tremendous emphasis on staying in control, not letting anybody know how you feel. As an illustration I can use with you, it will be lost on some of the younger ones. Remember Jackie Kennedy at the time of the assassination? Remember that public funeral? Can't you picture that, dressed in black, walking behind that horse-drawn caisson, strong, composed, cool? Few people ask the price of that. And we know later from her writings and what happened to her health-wise that the price of that was tremendous. We need to express our grief openly. Something else works against that. I hear people say, "Oh, I think my grief is selfish." And when I hear people say that, I know we've plainly failed in teaching, in church, in school. The English word selfish means self-absorbed, self-obsessed. Does grief come out of and touch the self? You bet it does. But that doesn't make it selfish. And sometimes people say, well, maybe it's not selfish, but I think my grief is a sign of lack of faith or a sign of weakness. And then I say, remember the people in Scripture. The great believers were the great grievers. They just got it out and expressed it. Express your grief. There's not time, but I could take another 45 minutes just talking about how people grieved openly in the time of Jesus, I'll mention 3 quick things. Number 1, you never had to grieve alone. Somebody dies, you walk out, you're immediately surrounded with a local chapter of weepers and wailers or something like that. That people gathered around you and they tore at their clothing and they reached down and they got dirt and they threw it in the air and they pulled at their hair. We call it primal scream therapy. It works. It gets it out. It encourages the person to do it. Second thing, you didn't have to talk to anybody for 3 days. Martha's walking down the street in Bethany and sees Sarah and says, "Hi, Sarah," and Sarah doesn't respond. Martha says, "What does she have her nose out of joint about?" She said, "Oh, her brother died the other day." She doesn't have to speak to anybody if she doesn't want to. An amazing awareness that we grieve in different ways. Third thing, you didn't have to go back to work for 7 days. In the Bible, 7 is perfect. Take what you need. Have you seen the contracts people sign these days about how much they get off because there's a death in the family and nothing at all for friends? Aren't we sometimes closer to friends than we are for family members? Yes, we call those primitive times. I don't think so. It sounds pretty advanced to me. Okay, another way to talk about the nature of grief is to think in quantity terms. Think of water in a reservoir or air in a balloon, and think of the grief as a quantity. It's generally related to the expectedness of the loss, the amount of emotional involvement, that kind of thing. Now, one of the problems is a lot of people choose what's called replacement therapy. Let's put something else in there. The family dog of 15 years dies. What's there the next day? New puppy? Right. Don't do that. Doesn't give people a chance to grieve. That's called replacement therapy. It doesn't work. Displacement therapy is let's push it down. Well, you push the air in a balloon down, and it presses equally on the remaining parts of the interior. That's exactly what happens in the body. You push the grief down, and it'll come out. The body will pay for lunch. Studies about grievers in the first year show higher incidence of problems of the lower back, problems of the gastrointestinal system, problems of the heart, and the latest studies, problems of malignancy in the first year of grieving. One study suggests we lose our will to live. It affects the immune system. We are more vulnerable. So that doesn't happen. We want to learn and give ourselves permission to express our grief openly and unashamedly. Another way to think of that is think about stages of grieving. Now, I need to tell you, I'm no great fan of stage language. I think we are too unique and individual. Stage language can be helpful in describing what a lot of people go through, but keep in mind your individuality. Some people like the model set forth by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross in her stages of dying: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. That works for grieving too, but a model I like better, probably because I had a hand in developing it, notice the humility there, but it's certainly not the work of one person. And that model goes like this: merciful numbness, facing the loss, expressing the loss, withdrawing from the relationship, returning to life. Let me unpack that. Merciful numbness. Well, one of you talked about that. The numbness, it's real. It's shock. It's God's way. It's a blessing. What does that shock do? It's incidentally psychological and physical shock. It's happening in the body. It filters out what we're not ready to fully handle. It's a kind of numbness. It also filters out something else. The horrid things people say to us when a death occurs, those views of suffering. It accounts for something else. Why frail grandmas and grandpas who we ask about how will they ever make it through the visitation. They're pillars of concrete, right? You believe Grandma? She stood for 3 hours and greeted people. She's in shock. It's a blessing. You don't have to give people medication. There's another blessing connected with it. What do they remember? Long line of people. Simple words. Sorry, thinking of you, praying for you. Arms around the shoulder. Merciful numbness. How long does it last? days, weeks, in some cases months, maybe as long as a year, for that weight to fully come in. I heard a person say recently, I thought the first year was hard, the second year was harder, to really have that come in. Now we have a problem. Because of merciful numbness, how people are gets misread. And so the kids who have come from California and Massachusetts say, wow, Mom, Dad's doing pretty well. I guess we can go home. We got to get back to work anyhow. Well, what happens is when the reality starts to hit, the person is alone. People say, where is everybody? The Jell-O brigade is no longer at the back door. The hot dish detail. I'm not belittling that, but it's needed more 6 weeks, 6 months later. The person feels terribly alone. If we have learned, if the person has learned to give self permission to grieve, then the person begins to express the grief in facing the loss. How do we do that? Nature's ways. Tears talk. Simple as that. Tears talk. Have you seen the new study of tears out of the University of Minnesota, a doctoral thesis? Identifies four kinds of tears. Think of a holiday dinner. You're peeling a potato, the knife slips, it cuts your hand. Can you hurt so much you cry? One kind of tear, right? You're peeling an onion and you tear up. Second kind of tears. Somebody tells a funny story at the table. Can you laugh so hard you cry? Third kind of tears. Somebody says, oh, that chair is deliberately empty this year to honor so-and-so. Tears there. You know the tears connected with grief have the highest hormonal content. Now, when the body sloughs off hormones, that's the body's way of getting into what's called homeostasis, getting back into balance again. Tears and talking. And a particular kind of talking starts with RE, remembering, reflecting, reminiscing, and then rehearsing. Grievers get their story down. I have people say to me, I think I told you that before, and I can say, you told me that 4 times before, just that same. I would never do that. I said, you need to do that. Now, that reminiscing begins very quickly, and it can account for something that to an outsider seems really weird. If anybody had told me in my training to do this, that I could go into a home where, as I did, an 18-year-old had been killed when a hangar door at an airport came down on him. And I could go into that home and spend 2 hours with the family, and I would see tears and hear laughter. I would have said, that's the dumbest, most insensitive thing I've ever heard of. I can't tell you how many times I've had that experience. Because what happens is that people begin to gather, they begin to reminisce, they remember, of course, the tragic and the sad, but they also remember the funny and the humorous. And so that reminiscing is very, very important. Tears and talk. When we do a lot of that, we begin to withdraw from the relationship. Now, careful here. That does not mean dishonoring, forgetting the person. It just means that we will realize it can never be the way it once was. Oh, I know how hard that can sound. But if we set up as a time when we're okay to return to life, that we will feel just the way we used to feel, we're never going to be ready. It can't be. That doesn't mean there can't be good days, good times, but we're not going to feel the way we used to feel because there's been a profound change. I was sitting with a widow whose husband died unexpectedly. She wore her wedding ring for a year, took it off, and she said to me one day, I was looking at my ring finger, empty, and she said, for the first time, I found myself remembering Frank, but no longer feeling married. That's withdrawing from the relationship. When that begins to happen, we are prepared to return to, I used to say normal, and then I realized I don't know what normal is, to life as normal as it gets with good days and bad. Now that good old American question, how long? How long? We have some studies about the length of grief related to particular kinds of death in the United States of America. Why that? Oh, it varies from culture to culture. Many cultures have grief customs, wearing black for 6 months, for example. Don't laugh at it, it works. Right? We don't have that. So the studies show that for an anticipated, expected loss or death, 1 year. What's 1 year? Oh, a calendar. Lacking grief rituals, we take what we have, the calendar. There's something, isn't there, about that first set of birthdays, special days, holidays, anniversaries that kind of moves us through that. Again, when you hear a year, that doesn't mean depressed or grief-stricken. It means to work through those stages. Now, this next, I've really always wrestled with whether to share or not. We have studies from University of Michigan that show for an unexpected, unanticipated, tragic loss, 4 to 7 years. Now, I've heard people grasp, I've had people get angry saying, why would you share that? That sounds like a sentence or a curse, and that deserves a response. What begins to happen to people is they shift their attention from their loss to how am I doing with my loss, right? When that happens, you put yourself in a very dangerous corner. It's like changing your focus from what has caused your depression to, oh my golly, I'm depressed. That's a difficult corner to be in. People say, what's wrong with me? It's been 8 months. What's wrong with me? I should be over this. It's been 2 years. And we need to say to people, no, for that kind of loss, it takes a long time. Again, please, that doesn't mean depressed, grief-stricken, down completely. It just means to work through that. Now, finally, some do's and don'ts, things to keep in mind if we would help ourselves and others. 1, please continue to do what you've done today. What's that? Learn. Learn. I don't know why we pay so much for learning if it's not practical, right? Yeah, we need to learn. There are wonderful books. There are tapes. There are seminars. Keep learning so that you can recognize why you feel as you do. We so fear being abnormal, right? Yeah, so it helps us to know we're not crazy. Learn. Be there. If you would help somebody who is grieving, just be there. Physical presence is so important. Now, if you're the griever and are kind of shy and introvertish, that means you may have to get a little more aggressive and call up and say to someone, I need somebody. Would you please come over? And follow it up with, you don't have to explain the mysteries of the universe or why bad things happen to good people. I just need somebody to be with me. Be there. Let the person speak. You may know the story in the book of Job where that terribly troubled man has 3 friends come to him, and the line is, they sat with him 7 days and 7 nights, and no one spoke a word to him, for they saw his suffering was very great, called one of the greatest single sentences of all literature. They were great comforters when they sat silently. If you know the story, it's when they opened their mouth and tried to explain why the stuff had happened. Then he called them worthless physicians, right? Okay. Be there, say little, listen a lot. When the person speaks, listen and go behind the words, identify the emotion, and respond to the emotion. Like this. Somebody says, not fair that my child was killed. It's not a time to launch into a defense of God and the universe. What's the emotion that you respond to? Doesn't look fair to me either, right? That's a permission-giving statement. Somebody says, I can't face the next 5 years with these 5 little kids. The answer is not, oh, you'll find a way. We have no right to say that. The answer is, that must look pretty impossible right now. Do you see the difference? That's an acknowledging, permission-giving statement. Don't avoid naming the loss and naming what has happened. The most angry, frankly, frustrated grievers I sit with, people say something like this. People come into this house and they talk about everything else under the sun except what happened. A few years ago, a Carthage graduate, 2 children, 9 months pregnant, got the news that her husband in a heat wave died of an asthmatic attack. I sat with her many times. She went to a family reunion about 6 months later, came back for an appointment, and I could tell things were not good. I said, it doesn't look very good. She said, it was horrible. I said, what happened? She said, nothing, that's the problem. She said, nobody said anything. I can't tell you how many times I've heard that. Now, I know what's going on. We see a griever, and the person seems to be doing okay, pretty well. And we say, I don't think I'll bring it up, right? If I bring it up, the person might get sad. If the person gets sad, the person might cry. If the person cries, the person might cry really hard. If the person gets out of control, I won't know what to do, right? Yeah, where's the concern? Yeah, I have never called 911 for a griever. Have I seen people cry really hard, break down? Sure. But the world doesn't end, and it's helpful for them to do there. Don't try to replace grief with anything. Good humor. You know by now, I love a good story. But grievers don't like clowns. They choose the times when they want to be cheerful and laugh. They don't want somebody setting it up. A man once said to me, pardon, it's his language, he said, if one more person comes in that damn front door and does the damn soft shoe routine, I'm going to throw him right out on his ass, right? What was he saying? Let me have my grief. Title of a very good book, incidentally. Let me have my grief. Don't try to replace grief with faith. Faith is central in my life, absolutely central. But the great believers of the Bible were great grievers. Faith runs alongside of grief. It does not replace grief. Grievers both believe and grieve. They both mourn and hope. It runs together. Help yourself and others to know what's normal. I'm going to mention a few things that people feel really weird about. Number one, anger at the person who has died. Anybody know anything about that? Yeah, it's very common. Of course, people feel tremendously guilty about it. But it has a tremendous emotional logic. The person feels really hurt, right? And is angry about that. And needs a target for the anger. What represents the loss? The person who died. And so the anger is toward the person who has died. Now, that's not a safe target. So people boomerang that anger and turn it in themselves, and you don't have to be a psych major to know I've just defined non-clinical depression. Often it's anger turned in. When you're depressed, ask yourself what you're angry about, and you don't have a safe topic or a safe target. Yeah. Second thing people feel weird about, sense of relief and release. Know anything about that? Yeah. 97-year-old grandparent, been in a nursing home, in severe dementia for many years. Hard to go out of town, get the news of the death, sadness and relief, right? And then something we hardly ever talk about in polite society. You know the only way some people get out of horrid marriages is when a spouse dies. You know, we don't talk about that. But there are a lot of people who stay married in horrid marriages for religious, family pressure, economic reasons, and when the spouse dies, it's a relief. I had a woman say to me, do you know the first thing I thought of when my husband died? And I said, no. She said, for the first time in 20 years, I'll go to bed and not worry about being raped in my own bed. Now, no woman should put up with that more than once, but she had. And it was a sense of relief and release when he died. Third thing people feel weird about, quick attraction to someone else, especially sexual attraction. People say, what's going on? I'm attracted to my best friend's spouse. You know, I don't know what's going on. I have these strange feelings, and I always say, welcome to the human family, friend. It probably says something pretty good about the relationship you were in, and now you miss that tenderness and that touch. And I don't have any easy answer, but I know you're not a great guilty person and you're not crazy. I was doing this in a snowy night way up in northern Wisconsin, and I mentioned this, and afterwards a person said, can I talk to you a minute? I said, yes. He said, you know what I've been doing since my husband died? I said, no. He said, I go to crowded shopping malls and rub up against people. He said, it feels good to be touched again. Now, there's pathos there, but you can understand the need there. Okay. Do's and don'ts. Support groups. They're not for everybody. They've been around forever. We've learned how to organize them and name them. They're not for everyone, but give them a try. Society of Compassionate Friends, SOS, Survivors of Suicide, Theos, they help each other spiritually. There's a whole bunch of them. The hardest thing is going to the first meeting. And you will know before long whether it's for you or not. But give it a try. Do's and don'ts. Use the faith that is yours. That may sound like strange language. But the longer I live, the more I realize there's a difference between having and using. I only have to think of our basement, right? It's filled with things we have and no longer use. You know that's not only true for material things, it's true of ideas and values and faith. Use the faith that is yours. What's using faith? Oh, that's meditation. That's worship. That's scripture reading, and that's not a cheap commercial for church membership. I mean, that's the way you operate the faith. Finding someone to love, someone to help. Use the faith that is yours. I have never worked with dying children. I'm not sure I could do that. I have a friend who has long worked with dying children. He told me a story about a 9-year-old boy who was dying. His mother came to visit, and the boy just picked up on something. He said, "Mom, you seem really scared today." And she said, "Yeah, I am scared today." He said, "Well, I'm scared too." But he said, "Don't you have some faith?" And she said, "Oh, yeah." He said, "Where is it?" She said, "Well, I guess I've had it in my hip pocket." And he said, "You better get it out. I think we're going to be using it." Use the faith that is yours. Identify it. Phrases like, "Nothing shall separate us from the love of God. God is a very present help in time of trouble. This too shall pass." Identify the faith that is yours, use it, and get a symbol for it. How did we begin? Do you have any wildflowers in a rusty tin can not far from your smoking ruins? For one person, it was spring wildflowers. For another, it's a Star of David, a Star of Bethlehem, a kite, a dandelion gone to seed, a bunch of balloons, an empty cross, an empty tomb, a picture. Get a symbol for the faith that is yours. Hang it around your neck. Put it on your dashboard. Put it on your kitchen counter. Why? Because symbols speak strongly, silently, sufficiently, and they help us to do what I think we have no choice but to do, which is to live with loss. But they help us to live with hope and faith too.